Thank you, Stuart, and thank you to you and Sustainable Prosperity and all those that work for this event and for the purpose. Well, as an ambassador, we are trained to greet all important peoples when we go somewhere. This I find very difficult today. I would have to go around the table again and mention everybody. So I'm very pleased to speak to such a distinguished group of people and experts to a very, very important issue. Well, with this event today, we also initiate what we call the Ottawa Climate Talks, supported by the Embassy. This, we hope, becomes a forum to discuss the issue. It's not to teach and to demand, but it's just to exchange views, to exchange positions and have a dialogue. And we will continue with a couple of other meetings in the course of the year. The last one being shortly terminated for the time being, dated for before the Paris summit, actually. So I think we are now very few days away from the G7 summit, where of course climate change will be on the agenda, and our last meeting that we participate and support will be a few days before the Paris summit. I think this is a good timing, actually. Climate change has become, over the years, one of the, if not the most challenging of the many global challenges we discuss. Of course, at present, looking around the world, there are issues from Ukraine to ISIL and Ebola that sometimes give the impression that climate change, after all, might not be the top priority. I think in the long run, this may be terribly wrong if you don't see it this way. And as much as I can say, I'm far from being an expert on this issue. I think things have changed a lot in recent years, also since the failure of the Copenhagen summit. I think there is no more discussion that this is an important issue, that we have to act, and of course it is not us, Europe, the European Union, and certainly not Germany's role to tell others what to do. I think it's a good approach that all countries do what they can do and contribute, and that when we come together in Paris, that there is an outcome that really helps to get to the target of not having a increase of temperature for more than 2 degrees. Somehow the debate we have now regarding climate change and what to do, how to reduce the output of carbon dioxide reminds me of what we discuss with regard to Greece in the European Union. I mean, it looks like people see as an alternative either austerity, no more growth and stability, or well, save Greece and then there will be no stability or so. No? And here it's the same with climate change. Some people think if you want to stop climate change, if we want to reduce carbon dioxide output, we can have no more growth. My government certainly doesn't share this view. We think an economy can grow at the same time when the carbon dioxide output is reduced. And of course the eventual target must be a much reduced economy, but a growing economy with new technologies, and so that helps us to save this planet in the interest of all people. Because this is not an issue of a single country, it's not an issue of the G7, although they of course can play a very important role, but it's an issue of all people, and we all can contribute, and not only governments, of course. I mean, that's also important. It's something where every single individual citizen in any country can contribute in his own way, how he consumes, how he lives, and so. And thus we have a lot to do, really, to reach out to people. And I see this conference today, and thank you very much also to the university that I understand this conference has become part of the Congress of 2015 of the Humanities and Social Sciences, the 84th Congress this year, and that's very helpful because there are so many people, more than 8,000 from all over the world gathering for this Congress, and they can also take note of what is going on in our debate and later on this afternoon. So thank you very much for being here. I'm really looking forward to very interesting discussions and pass on the word.
So first of all, I want to thank, of course, the Embassy and also Sustainable Prosperity for bringing me here. I first met someone from Sustainable Prosperity, or came across that name, probably about 5 years ago in Washington, D.C. when I was still working for the Ecological Institute. I built up and ran the office there. And Alex Woods came over, and we had a nice chat. And now I just learned that he left for the Ontario government, I think, which is testament to the quality of the work of Sustainable Prosperity. I'd like to make it very personal in my talk. I mean, I'm surrounded by so many people who know so much more that I felt, what on earth could I contribute that may be of interest to you all? But so I'll try to make it sort of a little bit about myself. So I was born in Bavaria, which, as you know, is a little bit different than most of Germany, but it's certainly very much Germany. But my mother was from Texas, which makes for an interesting combination, especially when you talk about energy and environmental issues. And I lived and worked on energy and climate issues about 10 years on each side of the Atlantic. And as you might understand, one of the things that has most puzzled me in all this time was how two countries which are part of the OECD, which are part of the advanced, industrialized economies of the world, could have such vastly different, at least policy trajectories when it comes to environmental policies and especially energy and climate policy. And so I started thinking about, how can we analyze this? Of course, there's a few very immediate differences between the USA and Canada and Europe. The first one is just the space. These are geophysical fait accompli. There's nothing you can do about this. It's a huge, huge geography compared to a very densely populated, much, much smaller Europe, which has implications for settlement patterns, for infrastructure, for the ability to have very tight public transportation grid, for instance. The endowment with natural resources, again, something where Europe is much, much less fortunate than Canada or the United States, and thus much more vulnerable to energy security questions, import dependence. So those are certainly important factors. But if you look at the policies, and you see those differences that I mentioned before, I think you can't all just ascribe that to that. I mean, in the US, the Northeast Corridor is very densely populated as well. You could imagine many similarities to some parts of Europe, and yet still the political landscape, the political framework is quite different. So I started thinking, how can you really try to capture the balance of the differences, and the reason for those balances? Now, I work at MIT now. I work primarily with economists, and I'm really blessed to be surrounded by so many talented economists who are doing fantastic stuff, quasi-experimental and experimental work, randomized controlled trials, testing how effective different policies are, how expensive vis-a-vis each other. I work right next to one of the largest integrated assessment CGE models in the world. Quite an impressive magic box, but I don't think I can really find the answers there. I'm a lawyer myself, and obviously law has some important roles to play in explaining some things, and certainly looking at Europe. I mean, there's some important court cases that upheld carbon pricing, both the carbon market and carbon taxes in member states. Surely also an important factor, the whole polity, the institutions, the party system, political system, those play a role, no doubt. We would have a stronger carbon tax in Europe. We would actually have one, to be correct, if we didn't have a unanimity vote requirement in the Council for anything that relates to energy taxes, but we don't, so we have a carbon market instead. So useful, but not really the explanation. Political science has done remarkable work. Matt Patterson here, Catherine, have done some awesome work. I know you're supposed to be here, on actors' interest networks to explain sort of the constellations and the dynamics in the climate policy making and in the political process. But what I really think, to me, has always been the most interesting source of explaining differences is history. And history, I think, of course, historians should be dealing with this, but somehow I don't see terribly much coming out of historiography, out of the historical disciplines. Who better than the witnesses? Those who were present at the creation, to paraphrase Dean Acheson. So many of you here. I remember, Stefan, COP11 was my first COP. You masterfully gathered it off. It was a wonderful, wonderfully run conference. And a few years later, when I heard that good policy should have made good politics and didn't, I was shocked. And I really felt, in a way, you were ahead of your time. It should have been, and it will still be. I'm absolutely confident. I mean, I could say similar stories for all of you. But anyway, So looking at Germany specifically, I tried to factor in this time dimension, not looking at a snapshot of what's going on right now, where there's plenty to talk about, very interesting stuff, but looking back into history. And it occurs to me that time is such an important factor in explaining where Germany is right now. The willingness to pay feed-in tariffs of 6-point-something cents per kilowatt hour and retail prices for electricity of around 30 Canadian cents per kilowatt hour. The willingness to pay an ecological tax on top of high mineral taxes for heating and for transport fuels. All that cannot be just explained by a few recent measures and a willingness of Germans to pay more and be sort of the green leaders. This goes much, much further back. And so I looked sort of across the Atlantic. How can you see differences emerging, say, over the last 80 to 100 years? Germany had a petroleum tax in 1879, but it really only introduced a modern fuel tax in 1930, partly to finance the build-out of the Autobahn. The United States introduced a federal fuel tax in 1932. Herbert Hoover needed to balance his budget, and this was the compromise. Some states had fuel taxes before Germany had. If you look at the trajectory, they both instituted them around the same time, but the angle is slightly different. Now, year after year, nobody's suffering tremendously by paying half a cent more per liter of fuel in Germany compared to the US. But after 50 to 70 to 80 years, you have compounded interest effects that permeate throughout the economy. The building stock is different because heating fuel is more expensive. The infrastructure is different because driving cars is more expensive. Not in the first few years, but after 30, 40, 50 years. And that changes, I think, the whole, let's say, fertility of the political ground to talk about higher prices, to talk about carbon prices across the Atlantic. That's maybe a bit of a depressing story because it suggests that you can't just have leadership overnight, something that President Obama had promised, right after his election. The US will become the climate leader and it will be a quick thing. And I fear that it's not so easy. It takes time. But it also means that it's never too late to start, and to start in small steps. I think that's one of the important lessons from Germany, one of the important lessons from Europe. If you look at sort of how the German ecological tax reform was instituted, how the carbon market has been introduced, it was always quite painless in the beginning. And heavy industry, energy-intensive, trade-exposed industry, almost always virtually completely or at least significantly exempted from any burden. But over time, the political thumbscrews are ratcheted down a little bit more each successive phase, each successive trading period. I think that's a key. I would have liked to talk also about some of the people that were involved and some of the unlikely alliances. For instance, the very conservative Bavarian member of parliament who in 1989 felt that his family hydropower plant, a small hydropower plant in a piece of land in Bavaria, was being cheated by the utilities when they tried to sell electricity generated from that, because they just gave him about 25 to 30% of what they paid for electricity generation themselves. And it was always a negotiation every 2 years. And he felt we needed a much more reliable, predictable network. She had a conservative, rural parliamentarian who brought in a policy in 1990, an act with 2 pages and 4 provisions, which by now has grown the share of variable renewables, not hydropower, variable renewables and biomass from about 4% in 1991, 1992, that was the hydro baseload, to almost 30% in a bit over 15, 20 years. Much of that in the last decade. Impressive policy. And see, a historical opportunity, an unlikely person to do so. Similarly with the ecological tax reform, similar with the successive strengthening of the Feed-in Tariff Act, and to some extent also similar with carbon markets. So you have to seize the opportunities when you have them. And finally, maybe one mention still, targets. I think Germany would not be discussing currently an additional levy on coal to close a gap of 22 megatons vis-a-vis business as usual, or the trend currently, and the target, if we didn't have that target to begin with. I think of the roughly 100 policies that Germany has in place that deal in some way with climate and energy. Most of those would not have been put in place if we didn't have that target constantly reminding us we have to do a bit more, we have to improve it. And it's a constant process of improvement, of tweaking, of fine-tuning, be it the carbon market, be it the Feed-in Tariff Act, and it continues. So all that perhaps just as a starting point for Germany. Happy to answer questions about what's happening right now. And I'm sorry, it's 9 minutes.
Okay. I go on. I just wanted to note that all the environmental movement started west of the United States and Canada. Greenpeace was born in Vancouver, and all the environmental movement was born in San Francisco. So funnily, and most of the science of climate change came from the United States. So funnily enough, things come and go. I wanted to say 3 things. One thing is that the problem is the planet. The problem is the planet. The problem is not local constituencies. Sorry, just that's one big problem. And the problem is, how do you invent something like planetary citizenship? How can you create that? And just to make the difference between United Nations and the European Union, because it's something I'm very keen on. The European Union is the only place on the world where you have some elements of supranationality. The supranationality, you have 28 countries, they decide something, they decide to reduce by 40% greenhouse gases, and they turn to the Commission and they say to the Commission, please, can you make a roadmap for the 28 country states? And they discuss and they get to something. In the United Nations, nothing, no roadmap, nothing. It must come from the sky. And of course it doesn't come from the sky. So that's a very, very important point, and something I don't very much understand on federal countries, because it should be also the same sort of mechanism. But let's forget, that's one. How do you invent a planetary citizenship? Very important. Because, for instance, if you look at the planet, you have a strategy. Okay? The problem is coal. The main culprit for greenhouse gases is the production of electricity by coal, and the main problem is that lots of developing countries have ordered right now coal-fired power plants, which are going to lock us at 3 degrees or more. So we have a big problem here, and so we have to create, it's a worldwide strategy, and it's only after that you see in each country how you can do it, how you can accommodate it, how you can implement it, how you can help. So that's one thing. Second thing, the increasing role of business and local governments. It's fantastic what's happening right now. Local governments and business seem to be more aware of planetary problems, more aware of planetary citizenships. Because, for instance, companies now are multinational. They know what's happening in different countries. Governments are locked into the frontiers, into the borders, and they have their eyes on the next election. That's the problem. Not local governments, funnily enough, and not business. And what is happening with business now? Business is saying to governments, are you serious? Okay, so if you're serious, please take decisions. Please have an agreement, of course, in Paris. Please have a long-term regulation, visible, predictable, and a price on carbon, of course. So that's the message coming from business. More and more, strong and strong. It's very interesting. Lots of initiatives being very encouraging. And the last thing, carbon pricing. I think it's a mistake to stick to carbon pricing alone. Because the problem is that climate change is not the only problem. We have a lot of other problems, a big conundrum of problems, of food, of water, of biodiversity, a huge amount of problems. So what you have to do is a comprehensive tax reform, greening the economy. If you green the economy, if it's a program for a government, you can pass your carbon tax inside of it, because it's part of the whole package. And you can explain that to your citizens. And you can have a sort of a program for a whole government, mandate, 4 or 5 years, etc. Change the whole fiscal system, the whole taxation system, to answer to the whole of the problems of the economy, of the ecology right now. And the answer is, we're going to have a very important negotiation in Paris. Yes, but the only way to combat climate change is to have the whole mainstream of the world economy to fight it. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Thank you.